There we go. That's the coffee. No. Oh, yeah. That I think that happens across the nation. Okay, so we made up a mythical dog that is kind of a combination of the behavior cases that typically Julie and I see. We get calls about their this is kind of a typical presentation. So owner reaches out and says, we just got a 2-year-old recently neutered male dog. He's a lab cross from a rescue or a shelter or animal control. We're having problems that he's jumping up, he's mouthing when he gets excited or during play. He's kind of a maniac on a leash. He doesn't really come when called. He seems kind of hyper vigilant about things going on around and in the house, doesn't really settle down. He's kind of shy with strangers, but he's fine at the dog park with the other dogs. And so we decided that this dog's name was going to be Skillet because it makes me laugh. It's one of the best names I've ever heard of for a black lab or a black lab cross. So I named him Skillet. So you can blame me for that. So, Julie, when you hear this description of the dog, right? What it mean when we're looking through this lens of a behavior consult, like that, all of that, I kind of my brain immediately points to just one or two things that if we unraveled those twinkle lights and supported Skillet and his family differently, they'd probably get a really different outcome. So when you're hearing this list, what immediately pops to your mind? Right. This is an adolescent dog. So his fear of missing out, his FOMO game is probably pretty strong. And coming out of a sheltering environment or a rescue environment, we have to remember that's a lot of stress hormones that are being released at each big change. So he had one going into sheltering. Right. Right. I agree. And then adolescent dogs really don't self-regulate all that well, kind of the same way that kids don't self-regulate very well. And we've all seen the cascade of the tired child into the angry, out of their mind, spectacularly unpleasant, uncomfortable child. Like that's a cascade that happens pretty quickly. When that's happened chronically, which often for adolescent dogs it has, I think it takes much longer to dig out of that hole than most people recognize. I also see lots of families who got a new dog and they know the dog's home and he's going to be loved and accepted. They want to show him off to the world. And the dog is often, I think, going, what planet did I just land on? Like it's a little bit like an alien abduction and a kidnapping. And he may not have his feet under himself yet, right? He may not know what's expected of him. He might not even know that Skillet's his name. Well, and just all the rule changes, right? Think about how disoriented you are when the grocery store like reorganizes everything, right? We're all mad for weeks until we figure out the new layout. I know with the holidays coming, already the grocery stores are like changing where they're putting things, right? Because all of a sudden it's cold here in Georgia, so now they put away the summer stuff and they get out all the fall and winter stuff, and you can't find anything. Like it's no longer is your grocery shopping quick, right? Instead of being quick and expensive, now it's lengthy and expensive. So I think often for our dogs, like we don't think about necessarily, families don't think about kind of orienting the dog to what the rules are, and that like my kitchen and your kitchen are probably laid out and things are stored with somewhat the same rules but not the same rules. The same thing happens to our dogs. So you know when we bring any animal in, the rules in each household are really different. I mean, some rules are probably the same, but the rules are different in each household. So it takes a dog a variable amount of time to see to sort that out, right? And sometimes the dog is like, well, I like the rules from the last house better. so 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 I look at sleep. I would agree. That's a biggie. I would also look at nutrition because likely this dog's gut has had some insults over the process. And I would look at medical. Like I would look at, do we have a urinary tract infection? Do we have, just a really good once over from a vet is hugely helpful in making sure we don't have a cracked tooth. We don't have, some anomalous, we don't have Lyme's disease that we haven't noticed before, right? Like we can just check that stuff out. And then I recommend starting with what the dog says is the first step, which can be really hard for families because we're like, no, I want to be able to take him for a walk around the block. And I'm like, right, but Skillet might not be ready for that yet. Right. So if, for example, trying to put the leash on Skillet results in trying to wrestle a little bit of a furry and happy alligator, then we kind of have to start with leashing and unleashing and handling the body and the collar and getting the dog less overwhelmed and excited and aroused or scared of all that handling, right? Um, so often people are like, well, he's awful on a walk. And I say, what happens when you pick up his leash and the dog immediately, like, his marbles are embedded in the walls? You don't have a leash walking problem yet. You have a dog who's sequenced in some understanding that from somewhere that is different than what the family ideally wants the dog to understand. The good news is, with classical conditioning, we can change those associations crazy quickly once we accept that the dog sets the starting point and the pace, not us. We are literally in a supportive role in the passenger seat. The dog is in the driver's seat. And for people our ages, that can be a bitter pill to swallow, because Julie and I are both of an age where we were raised where you told dogs what to do, and good dogs did those things and bad dogs didn't do those things, and you punished them until they did, kind of like how we were with kids back in the day. And now we've learned better that there are much better, kinder options for that. But it does take a little bit of a twist of the kaleidoscope, because the human often wants just what the human wants. I want to be able to go for a walk. And I'm like, you can go for a walk, just leave Skill at home. He's not ready yet. Well, and it's not something that vets regularly check, right? Vets very rarely just run a random urinalysis. That's not a normal part of a vet exam. So when we get that new dog, right, whatever was done by the rescue or the shelter, they did vaccines, they probably did a heartworm test. They might have run a CBC, hopefully, before they neutered. But we want to dig a little bit deeper and make sure we've got kind of everything um checked out. Right. So part of it is, I think there's a little bit of thinking in terms of what does this dog need to know to be successful in our home? I'm much more interested in um, does the dog know how to navigate the environment successfully and do the things we do all the time, leashing and unleashing, going potty outside, don't stick your face in the trash can, having the dog know what they're supposed to do during dinner time and where they're supposed to rest. And I think there's while it's not super sexy, being able to help a dog learn how to do those things then allows you to teach those obedience skills that you want. So, for example, if I have a dog who's hyper vigilant, looking out the windows all the time, I'm going to actually tether that dog in the house so they start giving up that behavior because I don't want that brain being constantly overstimulated and then end up with barking and launching at the windows and all the silliness, right? I want them to go, no, here in the house, unless it's an actual emergency, we're just not going to worry about all that stuff. Um, and getting the dog understanding what the routine of our life is and how to fit into that routine so that there's a lot of joy and laughter and sunshine and the dog knows what to do instead of waiting for the dog to just kind of somehow sort it out on their own. So it's funny, Gina, the trainer who handles our board and trains, um, is really funny because we've found that as we're teaching people like how to teach a settlement exercise while you're making lunch, we've had to literally say to people, now it's going to look like we're making lunch. We're not making lunch. We're just going through the steps of making lunch, but we're not actually doing that. That's going to happen after we've done this little training session. The dog gets put away for a nap, and then we're going to make lunch, right? Because you can't, I've not seen it be terribly effective to train the dog while you're doing life. That's a separate thing, right? So I teach the dog, like, I want you on the settle mat. That's where I want you to lie down while I'm in the kitchen. What a good dog you are. Here you go. When the dog has that skill nailed down, then the dog will be out when I'm cooking. But in the meantime, like I'm spending a bunch of time fake cooking, fake doing kitchen stuff, and reinforcing the dog. Because what I'm actually doing is training the dog. I'm not making lunch, right? It takes a little bit of skill to be able to then actually make a sandwich while the dog lays on their bed. so I would start also just creating a log, like a behavior log, a general log, right? Like when is the dog eliminating, where, account. Same with sleep. When did the dog go down for a nap? When did he wake up? Right? I want to gather data. And I also want to do a little bit of testing. What does the dog think the rules are? Right? Like what does the dog know and what does the dog not know? So we had a really funny case in class the other day that a family was getting frustrated that their down cue, the dog was digging at their hand with their foot. And I said, well, have you taught him paw? And she said, yes. And I'm like, show me the cue for paw. And it is identical to the cue for down. And I said, okay, so I'm like, okay, now show me your cue for down. It's exactly the same as the cue for paw, right? And I watched it wash over her face like, oh, I could see how that that confused the tally. So I said, well, this is easy. We'll just create a new cue for lying down that's really different than the cue you have for paw. So if the dog's decided that that means paw, we're just going to make that the paw cue, but we're going to change our down cue. And so that's what we did. And again, like dogs are really, really smart. They're really smart and they like to sort things out. So often a little bit of confusion we can sort out pretty quickly if we like literally ask the dog, well, what do you think a leash means, right? So if a leash means we're all going to fight and wrestle to get the leash attached to the collar, and then we're going to blast out the door like lunatics, and then we're going to drag the human around the block, barking and lunging at everything we meet. Well, not so much. That's not really what the human had in mind. So, so we just begin where we are. So, um, I start with trying to get a family to kind of curb their enthusiasm a little bit for this new dog. Like he doesn't need to meet every new person. He doesn't need to go for a walk around the block, right? Yes, he needs exercise, but if going for a walk around the block is awful, please don't keep rehearsing that. Like let's start with some other things, and then I give them some exercises to do to start to detangle those twinkle lights. Um, so the dog isn't over threshold, because a lot of times it's the wrestle match starts the whole, like trying to put the leash on with three kids running around asking you questions and they can't find their shoes, and now this one's shoe is untied and the dog thinks that attaching a leash means mouth my mom because I'm overstimulated by all this grabbing and noise. That might be where we're starting. Well, and honestly, I see a lot of fearful dogs who will close the distance because they're just trying to get it over with, right? They've been run into the situation so many times that they go in and then yell at the person because you're too close and it's scary. So I just tell people, if you think about your day, you walk through the grocery store, you walk through the halls of the school, you walk through the office, you don't touch many people during the day or the average week. Like I just simply I touch the people that I'm into, like that are intimately in my life, my partner, my good friends, some of my staff, like that we're super close. But I don't think I've ever touched my neighbors ever physically, right? That doesn't mean that I don't buy their kids bubble soap and sidewalk chalk. It doesn't mean that I don't take an Easter basket over. Like or take them candy at Christmas, but we're not hugging. Like we don't really touch all that much. And honestly, our dogs probably are happier with less touching too. Now, there are the exceptions, right? Marco, once you're in, like once you're one of his people, he is like all the cuddles all the time. Like he's a little bit like a furry leech, but a little bit. So, but right, Marco's definitely not that guy, right? He does not want to say hello to everyone. Right. So it's often interesting to me what people's expectations are because I think the ask for a dog of can you walk somewhere and ignore other dogs, like notice them but don't lose your marbles about them, and notice people but don't lose your marbles about them, either on the plus side of like hypersocial like Zuzu, or on more the side of like a dog that's fearful or concerned, right? I want my dog to try to just get to a place of neutral in the environment that they can take it in, they can go for the walk, but they're not straining to say hello to anyone. They're also not trying to run away. That's that's kind of the sweet spot from my perspective. Right. So we talk about like, okay, let's first get Skillet bonded to the family and let's get to know who Skillet is and what he knows and what he doesn't know, what he likes and what he isn't comfortable with. Then I begin the how are we going to move through the environment neutrally as a stationary exercise. I am not telling the dog to sit her down. I am literally playing the park and pay game, and then lots of look at that. Can you look at that over there? That's a Leslie McDivitt control and leashed exercise that gets a dog to check out things in the environment and then offer eventually checking back in with you. And it's a really great way to teach a dog how to regulate a little bit and to go, oh yeah, that's over there, but it doesn't matter to me. Right. So it's kind of like you and I are at the grocery store, a child is melting down in the frosted sugar bomb section. You and I look at that and go, yep, not my circus, and we keep moving, right? We do check it because if something awful's happening, if there's an emergency, we want to help. But once we assess like, oh yeah, that's not an emergency, that's just a child who's overtired in the grocery store who's quarreling with his mother, we just keep moving and like say a little, well, I say a little prayer for her, you know because I remember those days. You're doing great. So I'll give you a really good example. So we had two families who signed up for group classes last week, both with one with like an 18-month-old Jack Parsons that was relatively new to them. I think they've had him 6 months. The other one was like a 9-month-old Parsons Bull Terrier cross puppy, right? That one's owned by a college student. Both of them, when they signed up for the group class, said, I really want to curb, like when they listed their goals, it was like, well, I really want my dog to be less reactive on a leash. That was a big old red flag. That we reached out to those customers and said, hey, we'd like to do a private lesson with you first, so that one, we can assess whether or not a group class is the right way to start with this dog, but also to give you some tools between now and when that group class starts, that we stop the rehearsals that aren't working very well. So both of the dogs, oh, thanks. I mean, you're welcome to come on down. Um, so we used, again, we chatted a little bit about what we were observing with the dogs. Then we taught each of the families separately to, again, Leslie McDivitt control and leash exercises. We did look at that, and then we did Super Bowls. Those are really great exercises for dogs that are low reactive on leash. We got a report the next morning from the woman with the Parsons that their morning walk had been revolutionized, that her little dog has gone from jumping and lunging and barking at other dogs to looking, like just checking in with her and going, do you see there's a dog over there that could be a problem, I might need more space. um Already had revolutionized their walks, right? The barking and the lunging and all that had gone away. Um, so a huge change with just two quick little exercises that are super easy to do. The other young lady, I didn't get to talk to yesterday, but I think Stephanie did, and I'll get a report on that later about how her puppy is doing. So sometimes it's not it's not even going to take a long time to make a change. It's just beginning where the dog says is the beginning. Um, because that can be a sticky piece of it. Like if Julie and I were having a disagreement and I thought Julie was mad because I rolled my eyes at her, but what Julie was really mad about was that that I made some comment the last time we were on the call, then what I'm trying to fix and what Julie's trying to get sorted out are two separate things. and likely I was rolling my eyes about something that happened that may have even been germane to what I upset you about, 2 calls ago or whatever. So sorting out, where do we begin? Like literally untangling the twinkle lights for our dog or for a family member or in a disagreement in any relationship, a miscommunication. Often that root thing is really, really amenable to change really quickly once you figure out what it is, right? Right. I put a little star next to that. So yeah, so language matters. Our vernacular matters. So if I saw you out in public and said, "How are you?" and you said, "I'm fine," my response would be, "Oh my goodness, are you okay? Like, what's going on?" Right? Because fine's not good. Fine is usually, "Could you please hand me some chocolate?" Right? Right. Right. The other day, someone asked me how I was, and I was like, there was like a really, really long pregnant pause, and then I was like, I'm here, right? Like it is today. That's where we are, right? Right. Like so it was funny because the person knows me pretty well and was like, "Whoa, like that's not like you." And I'm like, "Right, I am right now reframing in my brain the current state of stuff and making a list of what to be gracious about, like what to have gratitude about, because it would be really easy in this moment to choose grumpiness and being unhappy over gratitude, right? Because I've kind of taken on a project that is fascinating and difficult and complicated and awful and sad and also a wonderful opportunity to love the world, right? So it's all of those things. And sometimes when I'm mired in the awful and the gross, I have to remind myself consciously to look for the opportunity. I will tell you that when someone says to me, the dog is fine with strangers, the dog is fine with me taking a bone away from him, he's fine with the kids, he's fine at the dog park, that the dog is not fine. The dog is not good. Well, right. And so, I mean, really, a good behavior professional is going to dig into that a little bit. I sometimes worry that we feel like people, it's not an interrogation. We're just curious, right? I don't want to miss something important. So what I would say in general, like, so for Skillet's family, right, they were like, we want the jumping up to stop, we want the mouthing to stop, we want to make leash walking more polite, we want Skillet to come when called, even though he doesn't really know his name yet. I want him to stop being hypervigilant. I want him to like strangers, and I want him to enjoy the dog park. Um, so sometimes I think I I unintentionally frustrate a family because that is not training. That is a lot of behavior to me, right? Like, why is the jumping up happening? It generally will happen for one of three reasons. It will happen for a dog doing attention seeking, right? A dog being overstimulated and overwhelmed, and it is a defensive mechanism, like, I'm going to jump up on you so you leave me alone. There is also comfort seeking, right? Right. So for example, we have a dog in class who takes treats really, really hard. It is not safe and it is not appropriate. And they've done all kind of the typical things people do to eliminate that behavior. When I started digging into it a little bit, it all starts with hands near the face. Um, and she's really concerned if you try to touch her head or her collar. I was like, oh, well, that looks like that's interesting. So as soon as we started conditioning that reach, all of a sudden the snappiness with the food went away, right? So that was an example of, we've been focused on the wrong problem, right? She's not really a shark about taking treats. She's worried about that close in handling as a young adolescent dog, right? So, well, and I did ask the question, like, is it possible at any time that when she was misbehaving, someone took her by the collar and marched her somewhere? And she's like, oh, yeah, that's totally happened in our house, right? And honestly, that happens in my house too. Like, Dovey this morning was like, I'm not going to my crate. I'm like, you are. I love you. You're going in, right? I didn't handle him harshly, but I was insistent. Like, sorry, dude, like, you're going to do what I asked you to do. There's going to be a reward for that, but you're going to, like, I love you, you're going to do it. Like, I'm not going to necessarily negotiate on a behavior the dog already knows, right? This is every day. This is what we do every day. Just do the thing. So, and I'll warm him up on it later and put that in my training notes of, like, okay, work on in and out of the crate a few times. He likes to come up with creative ways to be funny and a little resistant because he's a teenager. So it, what I would say is, I think sometimes I frustrate families a little bit in that they're like, I just want the jumping up to stop. And I'm digging into why the jumping up is happening. What I would say is that that's not being done by a behavior professional to frustrate you. It's actually the most efficient way to get to a solution, because the behavior is not happening in a vacuum. It is a response to something. It can be a lack of understanding. It can be being overwhelmed. It can be a negative history that you are completely unaware of. It can be inexperience. It can be all sorts of different, it can be a physical problem. It can be a vision problem. It could be all sorts of stuff. But pulling it apart and getting curious about it and solving the underlying causation often gets you to not jumping up much more quickly, even though we're not doing what everybody, necessarily thinks they should do to work on jumping up, right? So going to causation can be really, really helpful. Like, I understand that Dovey's resistance to going in the crate today was about that he wants us to play with him and interact with him more. So by being a little bit resistant, he's like, ha ha ha, that means she's gonna play a game with me for 5 minutes. I'm on to him on that. So I was like, okay, yes, I'm gonna play the game with him, but we're not gonna do it now, or I'm creating a new and different situation that I don't want. So right, right. So so it, right, so this sweet little lab that I was talking about, who's really sharky with treats, we I just free shaped a chin rest without treats. Like, I use treats as reinforcement, but I did not lure it because, like, again, it's a little bit like feeding a velociraptor. Um, and so by teaching her the chin rest and then teaching her a marker cue that I'm going to deliver the treat right into her mouth, it was like, in it's not hyperbole, and I am prone to hyperbole, but in 5 minutes we had a completely different response about taking food, about reaching for her head and her collar. Like, all of a sudden, she had a way to say, yes, I'm ready and I consent, or she could back her head away and say, I'm not ready. And we honored that. And all of a sudden, the sharkiness went away. Sharkiness that they've been dealing with for 8 months. And so they kept escalating. Understandably, they were kind of escalating their response to her. They weren't being ugly to her, but they were like, stop it. No, don't do, they were doing all the things of like, hey, you're hurting me. Right. So it was just a miscommunication. Right. So when I'm looking at this information of a description of Skillet, I'm like, okay, can you talk to me more about in what situations is Skillet jumping up? When Skillet, like, what happens just before the jumping up? Right? Because that tells me, is it kids are blasting through the door from school and Skillet's loose in the house, even though he's only lived there a couple of months and they don't really know him all that well, and he doesn't come when called. Like, now that's a hazard about the front door, right? It's also hazardous to the kids. Nobody likes having a lab cross tackling them at the door, even if it is enthusiastic tackling, right? So again, like I'm like, okay, well, when does the mouthing happen? Like under what circumstances? Like, does he just randomly walk over and put your forearm in his mouth? Or is it you're trying to put his leash on him and he's chewing on your hands? Is it you're trying to put his food bowl down and he's grabbing your arm? Right? Is it he's chewing on a toy and he puts it in your hand and then he's mouthing your hand and your mouth, your arm? Like, explain to me when that's happening, right? For leash walking, I would be like, where is the moment that he loses his marbles? And then I'm like, okay, does he walk on your left or your right? And they're like, and I'm like, right. So we're gonna teach one. We can teach both, but we're gonna teach one and then we're gonna teach the other. And and if and if he can't do it in the hallway when nobody else is home, he cannot go for a walk around the block with the leaves falling and the inflatables and kids riding bikes. Like it's like you went from playing chopsticks on the piano to now you're at a giant concert hall. Right, you're at Carnegie Hall. It's a little bit of a bigger ask. Like you might want to give him some steps between those two, right? For coming when called, I test, does the dog respond at all differently between me saying something like refrigerator in a sing-song voice and their name? Because often you would be stunned how many times dogs don't know their name. Well, and if they don't, just reclaim it, right? Like, so Mr. is a good example. Mr.'s name gets worn out because he's he's a little bit naughty. And so every day, like 10 or 12 repetitions, I say his name and he gets paid for that. Just doing that 3 days in a row, you get a dog who, when you say his name, he doesn't ignore you. He turns and looks at you and wags his tail, right? So moms out there or dads out there, imagine if every time somebody said mom, they gave you something you liked, right? It would you would stop pretending you didn't hear the call right away, right? We do the same thing with kids, like only we do it in the opposite, right? We come up with a dreaded middle name and that means we're serious. Well, you could just teach Gregory that when you say Gregory, he gets, a grape that he likes, and little Gregory will start responding to his name faster. Like it's just, you just make it worth their while, right? Or right, y'all get whiplash. Right. So so for coming when called, first I'm going to test, does the dog know his name? And then I'm going to ask more questions about that hypervigilance, because now I'm starting to wonder, like, okay, does this dog have really high prey drive and he's really fixated on squirrels? And so he doesn't come when called because he doesn't hear you, he sees squirrels, right? Like, is that part of the mix of why and so it's really easy to, again, look at that, start teaching the dog, like, you can look at all those things, but we're not going to go investigate them. And then practice, like, hey, could you respond to your name even when you're outside? That might mean taking venison with you, right? Saying he's shy around strangers, I would start pulling apart, like, which strangers, right? Is it people on truck? Is it vet staff? Is it people who are coming in your house? Like, when is that happening? And does he need to meet those people? Like, maybe he's a little introverted, right? Well, and I had a sticky wicket recently where I had somebody who wants their dog to be bomb proof, walking past dogs in their neighborhood behind a fence who she knows have killed other dogs, like pulled dogs through the fence and killed them. And I'm like, I personally, my personal ethics are I do not teach a dog that something that is actually dangerous isn't. Like, I don't lie to them about it. So, I, we have dogs who live next door who have pulled a dog through the fence before. I observed that happen. Um, my dogs are taught to acknowledge those dogs, but not to approach them and not to interact with them. Right? We don't bark at those dogs. You pay attention to me. I'll help keep you safe. We're not going near the fence. Now, fortunately, knock on wood, those dogs don't go over the fence, and I am eternally grateful for that, or we would have a different problem. So um, I do think it's important to recognize that a dog may not be reactive on a walk if another dog who is seriously menacing wasn't menacing, right? They should be concerned. You and I would be concerned about some neighbor brandishing a knife in their front yard, threatening us. It would be inappropriate for me to go, no, 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 Julie, that's just Bob. He just does that on Thursdays. Like, that's not okay. Like, it's still not okay. Like, Bob's got a little something, something going on. And I will say, with invisible, like with the shock collar fencing systems, I see more and more dogs menacing other dogs on a walk, understandably, right? They make bad things happen, and so the dogs start to build a negative response sometimes. Um, so sometimes I say to people, like, walking, like, you can't walk that direction in your neighborhood, you have to walk the other way, because asking your dog to walk past a dog who is quite literally threatening bodily harm and to just be cavalier and act like that's not a problem is not, in my opinion, I'm sure somebody will argue, but in my opinion, that's not safe or kind to your dog. um, Now, I have totally retrained those other dogs with permission of their owner to be like, hey, when I'm walking, don't menace. But that would be me approaching an owner, making sure those dogs aren't allergic to anything, making sure I have their consent and permission, um, which we did with our neighbor dogs. So now at least they don't try to drag Christopher through the fence when he's mowing the grass. So now they wag their tails and watch him. So a much safer answer. Uh, but again, like, there's a little bit of like, where do you begin? And I do think there are a lot of people who go in and get a new dog and bring them home and just turn them loose and go, congratulations, these are your new digs. And then they start making a list of things the dog's doing wrong, but the dog was never really got an orientation. And my experience is an orientation to your home takes 18 months. That's my experience, right? So, there is an internet thing that goes around that's like, 3 days, 3 weeks, 3 months. Yeah, that's not nearly long enough. Not really. Not really. In my experience, it really takes 18 months. and if if your dog doesn't come when called every single time, no matter what, they they're not ready for the dog park. They're not ready for the dog park because you can't save them if there's an emergency, right? If your dog can't walk nicely on a leash that has slack in it, and can't disengage from the environment and check in with you when you're like, hey, how is this for you? They're not really ready for a walk yet. It doesn't mean they're never going to be ready. It just means not yet, right? So if Yeah. So for example, I'm teaching a young adult how to do dishes, right? And so when I went and saw him yesterday, he was like, "Hey, the food containers that you brought us soup in aren't really clean, but I washed them." Right? So I was like, oh, "Okay, we have a miscommunication." He thinks rubbing the sponge over it with warm water and some soap is done. And my definition of washing dishes is getting them clean. And sometimes that takes more than one swing at it, right? I made stuff in the crock pot the other day that baked on, and I had to wash that crock 4 times before it finally really got clean. I didn't judge myself on that. I can't, it's a dark crock pot. You can't see the stuff that's cooked on until it dries because it's super shiny when it's wet. So you check it before you put it away. And so he and I had a little bit of a conversation about how he's doing dishes, and then I'll just do a tutorial for him when I come, right? And that the goal isn't that we run water and soap over the dishes. The goal is that the dishes are clean and ready to be used the next time, right? And that sometimes that means washing them more than once or using a different sponge or whatever. So, um, so I kind of just look at, okay, what are the most important things to start with? And then what's the next layer and what's the next layer until 3 years down the road, you have a dog who hopefully is just about perfect for your family and knows all the things, right? Our kids don't learn the ABCs the first 6 times we sing them. Our dog is not going to naturally know how to walk on a leash. That's a really big ask. That takes a tremendous amount of work. I will tell you, teaching really great polite leash walking, informal leash skills takes about 2 years. That's my experience. Sure, I'm happy to do that. Well, thanks for spending part of your morning with me. Nice. Okay, so I'll stop the recording.